I'm very skeptical of North Korean infantry's ability to be effective because, I mean, those guys, they don't speak Russian. The Russians don't speak North Korean. The North Koreans don't have any actual combat experience. So you're going to be taking essentially an organization that's not, assuming it's deployed, that's another thing. There's an assumption here. What I'm saying is that those 10,000 to 15,000 guys get deployed as a single unitary organization. They could be morcelized up into a series of replacements to just get slotted into existing frontline units, which would probably be even less effective. So it would be very interesting from a force structure perspective to see how they get employed. But I don't think that that small group of guys is going to make a massive difference.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. George is the head of their Russia team. George, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Good to see you again, James. Thanks for having me.
Wanted to start by getting your response to what seems to be the kind of mood music at the moment, which is that we could be close to some kind of ceasefire agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Were that to happen, and of course we don't know the terms, were that to happen, is it your sense that would be a strategic mistake for Ukraine and the West?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if there's a ceasefire that uses the conditions, anything that approximates what we have now, then it would be a strategic catastrophe, not only for the European Union, for NATO, for the United States, their interests, but also for Ukraine. I think a lot of people have found favorable the idea of let's just end the violence and the bloodshed. Enough Ukrainians have died, enough Russians have died. And I think that comes from a very human and overall good place. However, I don't think a lot of people that advocate that position have really thoroughly and robustly thought through what does it actually mean? What kind of conditions does that set for the future? And what does it look like for a round 2 or a round 3 if the Russians decide to have at it again, right? I want to talk about military readiness in particular. There will be a crisis of Ukrainian and Russian military readiness as soon as the shooting stops, right? Because right now the Russians, they generate roughly 30,000 troops per month. They also lose, killed and wounded, about 30,000 troops a month. So Russians are able to maintain the current tempo of operations, but they're not able to fundamentally rapidly grow their military. We know the Russian military has big shoes to grow into. Back in last January 23, then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced the planned formation of many large divisions. At least, I believe, 12 or 16 was the number. A division is roughly 10,000 people on paper. So they want to substantially grow the size of their military, but they're not able to do that. But when the shooting stops, they will be able to go back and staff these large units and send those roughly 30,000 guys a month, not immediately to their graves, but instead into large formations that will build up mass. So Russian military readiness is going to increase. And of course, as soon as we get the shooting to stop, sanctions enforcement is going to become weaker. The Russians will be able to access some of those components and parts that the West have denied, and so on and so forth. So Russia's going to trend up. On the other side of the equation are the Ukrainians. And I think this is really what no one's been paying attention to, which is as soon as the shooting stops, the political pressure from the Ukrainian frontline servicemen who have been fighting for some of them over a year with no rotations to demobilize is going to be insurmountable for Zelensky and for Kyiv. So those men are going to leave the front line. They're going to go back to their homes and their families. But moreover, when the shooting stops, Zelensky is not going to have the legal basis for martial law, which is what he has used to deny allowing military-age Ukrainian men from leaving Ukraine and going to the European Union, which Ukraine has a visa-free travel regime with. Tremendous number of Ukrainian women and children have left and gone to Poland and Germany and elsewhere in the EU. And when the shooting stops, the men are going to follow suit and go link up with their wives and girlfriends and families. What percentage of Ukrainian military-aged men are going to remain in Ukraine to deter and, if necessary, defend against a second Russian invasion? 20%, 30%, right? So as soon as the shooting stops, the Russian military is going to become more ready as time goes by. The Ukrainian military is going to become less ready as time goes by. And this really sets the optimal stage for Putin to be able to conduct a new wave of the war. Very similarly to how the Russians used the Minsk Accords and the Minsk ceasefire established in 2014 and 2015 to build up for 8 years and then conduct the 2022 invasion. So really the best thing that we have to do, James, is avoid this premature ceasefire, help the Ukrainians negotiate from strength. And that means imposing serious costs on the Russians in the meantime.
What about the argument that some people advance that if you gave Ukraine some kind of security guarantee, a commitment that they would be allowed to join NATO in the next few years, maybe membership of the European Union, maybe some kind of new defence security agreement with the Europeans, that would ensure that even if Vladimir Putin wanted to have a second bite of the cherry and launch a further invasion of Ukraine in a couple of years' time, he wouldn't be able to?
Look, if we can get a Teflon completely bulletproof guarantee that as soon as the Russians resume combat operations against Ukraine, there will be an unequivocal NATO or European or American military intervention to prevent that, then in principle, that could become viable. But even if that were the case, I would still want to deny the Russians the preferable battlefield geography that they currently have. Because then we have to negotiate and talk about, okay, if that's going to be the basis for a ceasefire, then okay, we also need to ensure that Ukraine will not be an economic ward of the international community in perpetuity, as it currently is set up to be. The Ukrainians have lost much of their industrial heartland that they need in the Donbass to be profitable, to just have net balance accounts and not just suck up aid. They need to have access to the Sea of Azov for the ports to be able to export grain, and they need to have more strategic depth so that the Russians in peacetime cannot simply fortify what they hold on the southern front line and risk to credibly cut off Ukraine and make it a landlocked state by removing the few Ukrainian ports that remain in Mykolaiv and Odessa. The southern front line, it's worth for the readers and listeners to look at a map. The southern front line exists with the current contours it does, not because it's a stable front line. It exists as it does because the Dnipro River is a major inhibitor of maneuver, right? Sort of like how the English Channel has always protected Great Britain for the most part from major ground operations coming across the European continent. The Dnipro River in Ukraine on a smaller scale serves as that buffer. But in peacetime, the Russians will be able to pull up their artillery elements, their bridging equipment, their engineering stuff, and it'll be much easier for the Russians to be able to spill over and cross and quickly get over the Dnipro River, because to actually use the river properly to defend it, to prevent Russian advances into Mykolaiv and Odessa, you actually need to not defend right at the bank of the river, but you need to have some strategic depth that allows you to fall back to the river. So when you look at the economic requirements for mineral extraction in the Donbass, when you look at the strategic depth requirements to have a stable front line to ensure that Ukraine cannot rapidly become a landlocked country in a second phase of an operation, you realize that you actually have to enable some significant Ukrainian counteroffensive. So look, if the plan is we're going to help the Ukrainians conduct a few more operationally significant counteroffensives, which liberate strategically necessary territory for Ukraine to function as a state, and then we lock in some really robust security guarantees so that we deter and if necessary defeat a second Russian invasion, that in principle can work. But all the proposals being floated right now they fall very short of any of those.
So if it is a strategic mistake to pursue any kind of ceasefire agreement, even if it comes with some kind of security guarantee, and I take your skepticism on that, what would be the alternative? Because a lot of people would say at the moment, the way things are, Ukraine is only being given enough to not lose this war. It's not being given enough to win. And whether we like it or not, sadly, at the moment, there is not the political will in enough of the Western world to give Ukraine what it needs to win.
Yeah, so that's where my institute and where our mission is look, we want to shape the policy and we want to remove the blinders from the eyes of the leaders, and we want to advocate for those policies which actually can create the conditions that help support the Ukrainians winning and the Russians losing. The fact of the matter is that for the last almost 3 years now, our policies have deliberately been designed in such a way to provide the Russians golden parachutes, off-ramps, buffers, and all of these things are designed to prevent the creation of negative momentum that works against the Russians, that can snowball and to leading towards a Russian defeat. We've been extremely scared about that. And we've hamstrung the Ukrainians with the restrictions we've placed as well. And we've made several concrete recommendations with regards to we can remove these luxuries that the Russians enjoy, such as a rear area, such as sanctuary space. We've not sanctioned the Russians nearly as hard as we can or should. And we should take risks in other parts of the world and redeploy assets and systems and tanks and armored personnel carriers that the United States has in long-term storage, but that are earmarked for other contingencies in Asia and Africa and elsewhere. And I would argue to those policymakers and say it's acceptable to take risks in the African or the South American or the Asian theater of operations because we have an actual hot war in the European theater, and the would-be actors in Asia are actually looking very closely to seeing if whether or not Putin can be successful in part or in whole in Europe before deciding to engage in their own adventurism in Asia or elsewhere. And so therefore it is actually an appropriate thing to take some of those tanks and those vehicles that are earmarked for one area of the world and send them to another. And I think, the way that the Chinese are increasingly supporting their support for Russia, the way the North Koreans are increasingly supporting their support for Russia, I think that substantiates that argument. So look, James, the bottom line is we are the masters of our own future. If we want to continue to insulate the Russians from defeat and prevent the Ukrainians from being successful, then we're going to be successful at that, and we have been so far.
Hello, it's James here. Sorry to interrupt this episode of Frontline. I just wanted to tell you about a brand new YouTube channel from Times Radio called Times Radio History. And one of our shows is called History Undone. Every week we take a different iconic battle from history and play it back, asking could it have played out differently? Could it have led to a different outcome? And if it did, what would the long-term historical consequences have been? We've done episodes on D-Day, we've done episodes on the Battle of Gettysburg, on El Alamein, on Stalingrad, and our latest episode is all about the First Battle of Ypres in 1914 in the First World War. To check it out, subscribe to Times Radio History. And now, back to Frontline. You mentioned North Korea. How significant is the apparent deployment of North Korean troops to Russia to fight in Ukraine?
I think it all depends on the scale, right? So I just want to be very clear. ISW, we've not been able to collect any data that dispositively proves that the North Koreans are in Ukraine fighting. There's, of course, those videos that made the rounds last week of the supposed North Koreans in Russian uniforms at training grounds that were geolocated to the Russian Far East. If what the Ukrainian intelligence and the South Korean intelligence are telling us is true, we can probably expect about a division's worth, so again, somewhere between 10 to 15,000 troops worth of combat power deploying to Ukraine. If that happens, it'll be very interesting, I think, to study and see how the Russian command decides to use those North Korean troops. Are they going to be thrown directly into a meat grinder, or are they going to be put on a more dormant part of the front line, say like in Kherson or something, to relieve Russian troops to then be able to redeploy and go to where the active fighting is? Because I'm very skeptical of North Korean infantry's ability to be effective, because those guys, they don't speak Russian, the Russians don't speak North Korean, the North Koreans don't have any actual combat experience. So you're going to be taking essentially an organization that's not, assuming it's deployed, that's another thing. There's an assumption here. What I'm saying is that those 10,000 to 15,000 guys get deployed as a single unitary organization. They could be morcelized up into a series of replacements to just get slotted into existing frontline units, which would probably be even less effective. So it'll be very interesting from a force structure perspective to see how they get employed. But I don't think that that small group of guys is going to make a massive difference. Asterisk, unless they become the lead element for what will become a regular pipeline that doesn't just bring in 10 to 15,000 North Koreans in one triage, but a steady stream of tens of thousands of North Koreans will now regularly be going to Russia to go fight. That can actually make a difference. I also think that the North Korean deployment scenario is interesting for what not it tells us about North Korea, but what it tells us about Russia's own force generation. It's been very interesting to look and see how Russia's current model for generating forces has become increasingly dysfunctional with time. So right now, the lead model is, they call them, the generation of volunteers. And the way that works is each of Russia's federal constituent entities, they're called federal subjects, the governor has a quota to meet for how many volunteers to generate per month. And they entice that economically by putting out these one-time signing bonuses and other economic benefits that the volunteers receive. And you can actually plot and see the supply and demand curve over time and how they've changed for these servicemen by looking at the one-time signing bonuses. So some federal subjects used to offer bonuses like 2 years ago around 10K rubles. Now the signing bonuses are anywhere between 1 to 2, sometimes even higher than 2 million rubles. And so that tells us that the Russians, due to waning demand, they've had to increase how much they're going to compensate to offset that waning demand. And ceteris paribus, if all the trends continue as they are, it seems like this Russian system for force generation is going to become more or less dysfunctional and just stop working probably within the next 12 to 18 months. At which point, Putin will probably have to call another mobilization. He always maintains that option. It'll be deeply unpopular. But now seeing them stand up this alternative pipeline to get North Koreans, that really does tell us that, look, Putin might be running out of the volunteers from the regions. He does not want to go after the politically sensitive Russians that live in Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? He continues to want to insulate them, and he'd rather go to North Korea than to his own people. So I think that is interesting. And look, Russia will continue to be able to finance this war and support this war. But it has to, it really does show the deficiencies of our own policies and how we've assumed that, look, we can just outweigh the Russians. We're not going to be able to outweigh the Russians. We have to actually impose defeats on them. And look, if the Russians become a combined North Korean Russian army in any sort of meaningful way, and if the North Koreans become responsible for a sector of the front, and the North Korean troops are on the whole less up to snuff than the regular Russians are, then that can create some opportunities for exploitation on the seams or wherever the North Koreans and the Russians are operating. But I don't know that we're thinking that deeply.
We should probably also mention what's been happening in Moldova over recent days. They've had a referendum on future membership of the European Union and enshrining their constitution a commitment to join it. Russia obviously is against that referendum, that motion being passed. It did pass very narrowly. Just unpick the significance of that if you can, George.
Sure. Well, I'd like to plug some work that my colleague Christina Harward just did. She just the other day published a report on Moldova. Moldova, it's a great report. Please read it and watch it. Look, Moldova is going to continue to be a battleground state for the next decade. We've encountered a lot of thinking from think tanks and other scholars of the region here in Washington, where people basically say, look, Moldova, it's a slam dunk. We've already achieved victory in Moldova. They're heading towards the inevitable integration path for the European Union that many Eastern and Southern European states have. The Russians can't get to Moldova because Ukraine is in the way. And Moldova is basically just a slam dunk, and it's a given. And we pushed back against that assessment and said, no, actually, Moldova's path to European integration and further reform is actually quite fraught. And there's a lot of opportunities due to the peculiar circumstances of Moldovan politics and government and law that give the Russians many courses of action and options for how to be able to derail and screw up Moldova's European integration. Lest we forget, the Russians occupy part of Moldova with the breakaway Republic of Transnistria in Moldova's east, where about 2 Russian motorized rifle battalions have been stationed since the early 90s illegally. There are new exclaves, well, not exclaves, but there are new political cleavages within Moldova that the Russians are trying to develop. There's an autonomous region called Gagauzia that the Russians are trying to essentially turn into a Russia-friendly political lever within the country. There are nuances about the appointment of judges for the Moldovan Constitutional Court that are very interesting and that provide the Russians opportunities to be able to derail this. And then there are also different circumstances with regards to the Moldovan parliamentary elections that will happen down the road that also give the Russians plenty of opportunities to be able to sabotage the accession. So don't get me wrong. The recent referendum and the vote to officially enshrine the objective of joining the European Union is a victory for Moldova. It's a victory for us, but victory is not guaranteed, and the Russians are going to be trying tooth and nail to be able to derail this, kind of like how the Russians intervened in 2014 to derail Ukraine's European integration when the Ukrainian government at the time was trying to sign an association agreement with the EU. And to get back to the first thing that we talked about today, Russia's bandwidth to be able to interfere in Moldova is currently limited because it's all tied up in this horrific war in Ukraine. As soon as the shooting stops in Ukraine, that gives the Russians a tremendous amount of bandwidth to be able to pivot and look to other countries that they're interested in also reestablishing Russian suzerainty over, including Moldova, including Georgia, including Armenia. And so Ukraine is really, within our interest to ensure that we can defeat the Russians, keep them tied up there, as opposed to advancing their control over other countries.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. And just briefly, George, to round things off, I mean, normally when we have these discussions, we start with what the latest situation is on the ground, on the front line itself. Because there is so much geopolitical discussion about the future of this conflict, we've kind of done it the other way around this time. But just bring us up to speed with what is happening on the front line.
Yeah, absolutely. So tempo of operations, generally speaking, remain very dynamic. They've slowed in some parts, they've intensified in others. Back in early October, I'll sort of start in the north and then work my way around the theater clockwise. In the Kursk area of operations where the Ukrainians are operating, the Russians began a major counteroffensive against that effort in early October, and the Ukrainians have reintroduced some reserves to counterattack against the Russian counteroffensive, and it's really unclear whether or not the Russians are going to be able to seize everything or if the Ukrainians will hold everything. The Russians are confirmed to have recaptured at least one-third of what the Ukrainians initially took. The Russians claim that they've gotten a half, but again, getting data from there is sometimes like staring into an abyss, and so it's hard to be able to verify quite everything. But as I've said before, it's really not that interesting whether or not the Ukrainians hold that territory or if the Russians retake it. I'm confident the Russians can retake it if they really prioritize it. The real question is, will Putin reinforce not just that area where the salient is, but what will Putin do with regards to that additional 1,000 kilometers of international border that the Russians have basically enjoyed to not have to protect or resource for the course of 2 years. And it's unclear how Putin's going to respond to that. If he doesn't reinforce it, then the Ukrainians can do this again at a place and time of Kiev's choosing. Going around the theater to the Kharkiv area, the international border where the Russians began their Kharkiv incursion back in May, that slowed down. The Ukrainians have conducted counterattacks in that area. The Russians did have to rob Peter to pay Paul to take some forces there to respond to what was happening in Kursk. So not a whole lot of interest is happening there. Slightly further to the east of there, in the sort of northeastern corner of the theater near Kupiansk, that area is deteriorating. Last week, Ukrainian authorities announced the mandatory evacuation of civilians from Kupiansk and its surrounding satellite villages, and the Russians have managed to advance up to the Oskil River, splitting sort of the Ukrainian holdings in that area into two. It seems that the Russians are expediting their ground operations right now to seize as much as they can ahead of, number one, bad weather conditions which are starting to affect operations because we're heading into the mud season now with the fall rains. And the Russians are also trying to expedite their combat operations now to seize as much ground as they can ahead of any sort of unpredictable scenarios that could happen from the American presidential elections that we have coming up in just under 2-3 weeks here now. Keep going down to the south near Bakhmut, eastern Ukraine. Not a whole lot of changes near the Chasiv Yar direction. The Russians have deprioritized that area of operations. Further going down to the south near Toretsk, the Russians have been making some tactical gains. Fighting is happening within the urban environs of Toretsk. It's a very complex operating environment where you might have Ukrainian defenders on the 5th floor of a building, but then Russians on the 2nd floor, and then the Russians will keep going, on the ground, and so the lines are very messy. It's unclear whether or not the Russians are going to be able to seize Toretsk within the coming weeks or months, or if it's going to be a protracted, long, bloody battle. Keeping going further to the south, near the Avdiivka area of operations, heading towards Pokrovsk, I'm increasingly confident that the Russians will not seize Pokrovsk by the end of this year. The tempo of operations has fortuitously decreased there, and it actually seems that the Russians are in many ways prioritizing what's happening not to the immediate east of Pokrovsk, but they're working to try to create a better battlefield geometry. They stopped trying to penetrate laterally, longwise, and they are now building out the flanks. They're trying to widen the penetration, likely to make the Russian protrusion safer against Ukrainian potential counterattacks or counteroffensives in the future. They're also trying to level out sort of the southeast corner of the theater with the recent seizure of Vuhledar and the advancement of some tactical fields in that direction as well, to be able to potentially resume larger operations in the Pokrovsk direction potentially next spring. Zaporizhia southern front line and the seam between Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts, this is very interestingly reactivated in a way that we've really not seen in a long time. In early October, we started to see reports that the Russians resumed combat operations near the Kakhovka Reservoir, sort of not too far away from Enerhodar, where the nuclear power plant is. They managed to cross across a dry part of the reservoir and engage in some very small level, small level attacks within some neighborhoods around Kamensk, which was interesting because we've really not seen combat operations on that area of the front line since the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023. And then on the seam between Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts, just south of the town of Velika Novosilka, the Russians also restarted combat operations there and claimed to seize one village called Levadna. At the end of the day, there's really not a whole lot of changes on that southern front line. It is largely dormant. It's not a priority area. But whereas for the last year, basically, we've not seen any kind of movement from either side of significance, now we're starting to see the Russians reactivate and conduct some small scale attacks. And to round it all off, southwest corner of the theater, the Kherson line near the Dnipro River, the river delta, no significant changes in that area. The Russians claim that they've recaptured many of the islands on the delta, but fundamentally, the Russians are on the left bank, the Ukrainians are on the right bank. Special forces and naval infantry do raids on the islands and stuff, but no changes there.
George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.